In a packed courtroom buzzing with tension, a black woman enters quietly and takes a seat. A white cop notices her presence and starts loudly berating her for sitting in a reserved area. His arrogance fills the room, but her silence, posture, and calm gaze unsettle something deeper. She utters just one line, and it freezes the room. "We got enough of your kind sneaking into this place already. You people don't belong here." His voice cracked through the silence like a whip, loud, public, intentionally humiliating. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the sound, some in surprise, others in silent agreement, a few in shame. It was 9:01 a.m. The courtroom was full. Lawyers straightening their ties, jurors trying not to make eye contact. A few murmurs here and there, but mostly the thick anticipation of a day in court. Sunlight streamed through high windows, catching the flecks of dust hanging in the air, like slow-moving ash. The judge hadn't arrived yet, and that's when she walked in. She wasn't wearing anything dramatic, just a deep navy coat, black dress pants, and polished shoes. No earrings, no makeup, hair tied back in a low bun. She looked like someone's grandmother, or maybe a retired librarian. But the way she walked, slow, deliberate, like she knew exactly where she belonged, made everyone glance up just a little longer than usual. The cop noticed too. He was standing near the front pew, leaning against a marble column like he owned the place. Officer Daniel Crow, mid-40s, blonde buzz cut, badge polished to a mirror finish, the kind of cop who wore his ego tighter than his uniform. He squinted. When he saw her take a seat in the front row, that row was usually reserved for legal teams or press, but nobody had claimed it this morning, so she sat. That was enough. He straightened up, stomped over with the weight of entitlement in every step, and spat the words for everyone to hear. "You people don't belong here!" The woman didn't flinch. She didn't look around. She didn't blink. She just turned her head slowly and looked up at him, calm, eyes steady, like she'd heard this line too many times in her life to care anymore. Silence. Even the bailiff, seated near the judge's bench, froze mid-page in his newspaper. The cop didn't stop there. This is a court of law, not some place you just wander into looking for free heat. You deaf or just ignorant? A soft cough came from the back of the room. Somebody shuffled in their seat. Nobody stood up. Nobody spoke up still. She said nothing. Officer Crow leaned in. "Lady, I said..." She raised one hand, not aggressive, not abrupt, just enough to pause him, and then she finally spoke. "You should Google me." The words hit harder than a shout, crisp, controlled, a tone too precise to ignore. Crow blinked. She turned her head away from him like he was background noise, adjusted her sleeve with gentle care, and crossed her legs. At the back of the courtroom, someone, an older black man in a grey suit, smiled faintly and lowered his phone, as if he'd just recorded what needed to be seen. Crow opened his mouth, but before he could fire back, the doors to the judge's chamber swung open. "All rise," the bailiff called out, voice suddenly energized. Everyone stood. The woman rose. Too slow again, like time moved at her pace. Her shoulders didn't flinch, her eyes didn't dart. She was anchored, immovable. Crow stared at her, jaw slightly open, still waiting for something to make sense. She glanced at him once more and said barely above a whisper, "They thought I was a stranger. I wrote the damn laws." Then she turned back to the bench, her face unreadable. The judge hadn't even spoken yet, but the courtroom had already shifted. The power in the room belonged to someone else now. Officer Crow stood stiffly in the aisle, pretending to scan the courtroom like he was doing his job. In reality, his mind was spinning. That woman, who the hell did she think she was? Her confidence wasn't normal, not from people like her. He'd humiliated dozens of these types before. Some had cried, others had gotten loud, but none had shut him down with a whisper. "You should Google me." He hated how the line echoed in his head. mocking him. Calm power disguised as passivity. It didn't fit the script he'd memorized from years of policing neighborhoods like hers. He leaned closer to the court reporter. "You know who that is?" he asked, nodding toward the woman now seated with her hands folded neatly in her lap. The court reporter, an older white woman with reading glasses and tight grey curls, glanced over her glasses and gave a polite shrug. "Not sure, but she doesn't look confused to me." Crow clenched his jaw. He hated ambiguity, especially when it came from someone who should have been easy to dismiss. The judge entered, a no-nonsense type named Macmillan. White, heavy-set, thick glasses, and an attitude carved from 3 decades on the bench. Crow had worked with him before. Macmillan didn't tolerate disruptions or grandstanding. Everyone sat. The proceedings began. A fraud case involving a local business accused of stealing federal aid money. Lawyers argued motions, jurors scribbled notes, and Judge Macmillan's gavel cracked against the wood more than once. But Crow couldn't concentrate. He kept glancing at her. She didn't take notes. She didn't whisper to anyone. She simply watched. Her eyes never wandered, her hands never fidgeted. It was like she wasn't observing the trial. She was measuring it. At one point, the defense attorney stood up and asked for a 15-minute recess. Granted, people stretched. Some filed out to get water. Crow made his move. He stepped into the aisle and approached a young black clerk, clipboard in hand. "Hey," he said quietly, "do you know who that woman is?" He didn't say it with curiosity. He said it with suspicion. The clerk glanced at the woman, then looked back at Crow. "That's Dr. Hughes." Crow raised an eyebrow. "Doctor?" "Yeah. Civil rights historian, law professor. She, wrote the state's updated discrimination policy." The clerk lowered his voice. "She's been consulted on federal cases. I think she helped design this court's new ethics training, too." Crow blinked. His stomach tightened. "Why's she here today?" The clerk shook his head. "Not sure. But I wouldn't mess with her, man. She's got half of D.C. on speed dial." Crow felt something stir in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling. Was it fear? He returned to his post at the column, lips pressed tight. The courtroom looked different now. That woman, Dr. Hughes, wasn't just some bystander. She was woven into the system deeper than he'd ever be, deeper than any badge could carry him, but he couldn't let that show. Not here. Not now, so he did what came naturally. He tried to regain control. He walked slowly back to her row and stood just close enough for her to feel it. Not say anything, just presence, just shadow. A silent threat. She didn't turn, didn't blink, didn't even adjust her posture. That made it worse. "You know," he muttered, "a courtroom isn't a place for theater." She replied without looking. "Then stop performing." Crow's throat dried. He turned away. Across the room, a prosecutor approached Judge Macmillan with a folder in hand. They whispered briefly. The judge nodded. Then something strange happened. Judge Macmillan looked up, eyes scanning the courtroom, and stopped directly on Dr. Hughes. "Dr. Hughes," he said, his tone suddenly respectful, "would you be available to sit in chambers for a moment during recess?" Whispers erupted. Crow's skin went cold. She stood slowly, gave a single nod, and followed the judge through a side door without looking at anyone. The prosecutor followed. Crow just stared. He knew now. This wasn't just some woman sitting in the wrong seat. She wasn't lost. She wasn't irrelevant. She was above him, and he yelled at her in front of a full courtroom. He sat down on the pew, hands on his knees, pulse racing. For the first time in years, the badge on his chest felt like a toy. Behind the chamber doors, the conversation was brief but powerful. Judge Macmillan gestured for her to sit. "Thank you for being here, Dr. Hughes. I understand the state requested your presence for internal review." She nodded. "I'm observing patterns, behavior, environment. You know how it works." The judge sighed. "And Officer Crow?" "I've documented what I needed." Macmillan looked almost apologetic. "I'll be in touch after proceedings, discreetly." She nodded again, no emotion on her face. The prosecutor gave her a respectful glance. "We're grateful you agreed to remain anonymous for now." "I'm not here to humiliate," she said softly. "I'm here to calibrate." Macmillan chuckled grimly. "Then I hope you brought a damn wrench." Back in the courtroom, Officer Crow felt his grip slipping. Every eye that glanced at him now held something new. Judgment, confusion, maybe even amusement. She returned 20 minutes later, quietly, gracefully, and she sat again. Same place, same seat. This time, Crow didn't say a word. He didn't look at her, but inside, the collapse had begun. The recess ended, but something in the air had shifted permanently. When Dr. Hughes re-entered the courtroom, she didn't rush. She didn't smile. She just walked in like the room had been waiting for her, and in a way it had. Every pair of eyes followed her. Not because of the color of her skin this time, but because people finally realized they had no idea who they were dealing with. She returned to her seat in the front row, crossed her legs, folded her hands. Same posture as before, but the room didn't see the same woman. Officer Crow stayed glued to the side wall like a sentry whose post had become a punishment. He watched her like a hawk, but he didn't dare move close again. Whispers floated through the air like perfume, just loud enough to stir curiosity, just soft enough to avoid clear accountability. "Is she with the DOJ? I heard she's from Harvard. Someone said she helped rewrite Title IX policy. Why's she even here?" Crow heard every word. Each one felt like a slow needle pressing into his neck. He looked at the defense table. One of the junior attorneys, a young white guy in an overpriced suit, was sneaking looks at Dr. Hughes between notes. Crow caught his eye. The kid blinked and quickly looked down. Even the jury was different now. One juror, an older black woman with silver braids, kept nodding faintly every time she glanced at Hughes. Another, a middle-aged white man in flannel, had started avoiding Crow's gaze entirely. Crow could feel it. The tide was turning, but he wasn't done. He stepped out into the hallway, pretending to check security placements, and quickly called his precinct supervisor. "Yeah," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "You know a Dr. Hughes?" Black woman, probably mid-60s, real composed, sitting in on today's case. "Something's off, and I think she—" The voice on the other, and cut him off. "Wait, Dr. Loretta Hughes. You're talking about that Hughes?" Crow's silence said enough. "Daniel," the voice continued, slow and cold now, "you didn't say anything to her, did you?" Crow swallowed. I might have told her the seat was reserved, that's it." "You told her? Or you yelled? At her?" Silence again. "Jesus Christ, Crow. She's been with the Civil Accountability Commission for 15 years. She has personal contacts with 2 circuit court judges, the state attorney general, and 3 senators. Do you know how many complaints she's authored?" Crow's pulse quickened. "Nobody told me she'd be here. You think someone like her needs to announce herself? She watches quietly, writes publicly, and burns institutions down in the press without ever raising her voice." The line clicked dead. Crow leaned against the marble wall, hand trembling slightly around the phone. The badge felt heavier than ever. Inside the courtroom, Judge Macmillan resumed proceedings. But the rhythm had changed. Even the gavel sounded more measured now. As the trial rolled forward, something strange started happening. People started looking at Dr. Hughes for silent cues. A brief smile from her when a point was well argued. A calm head tilt when someone lied under oath. No words, no gestures, just the weight of her watching was enough. At one point, the prosecutor mentioned the Civil Rights Review Committee. It wasn't part of the case, but the words landed like a thunderclap. Half the courtroom glanced at her. Even the judge paused his note-taking for a beat. Crow re-entered slowly, trying to mask the unease on his face. He stood back near the rear corner now, far from his earlier position, but still watching. He couldn't stop himself. Dr. Hughes never acknowledged him, not once, and yet that was worse than any punishment. Her silence wasn't passivity, it was power. It stripped him bare, made his aggression look childish, made his authority look like theatre. Then came the note. One of the clerks approached Dr. Hughes and slipped her a small folded paper. She opened it calmly, read it, folded it again, and placed it in her coat pocket without reacting. She stood and walked out. No one stopped her. Crow's instincts kicked in. He followed her out into the hallway a minute later, trying to appear casual. She stood by the window near the courthouse stairs, looking out at the morning light. He cleared his throat. She didn't turn. "I didn't mean to offend you," he said quietly. Still nothing. He tried again. "I was just doing my job. You looked like you weren't supposed to be in that seat." She spoke without turning. "And you decided that based on—" Her tone wasn't angry. It was clinical, like she was logging the interaction for later use. Crow hesitated. I've just been trained to profile." He froze. "No, I didn't ask for your apology, Officer Crow," she said, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were calm but unblinking. "But your reaction tells me everything I came here to see." She began walking down the hall. Crow stood, paralyzed. She paused before turning the corner. "The badge doesn't make you right. It just gives you the opportunity to prove you are." Then she was gone, and Crow stood there, knowing in his gut this wasn't over. By the time Dr. Hughes left the courthouse, her presence was already legend. Not officially. Not in any announcement or press release, but in the silent glances exchanged in elevators, in the whispered comments across phone calls, in the way people paused conversations the moment Crow walked by. The courtroom had returned to its proceedings, but a ghost lingered, hers, and with it a question that infected every corner of the courthouse. Did he really say that to her? Back in Judge Macmillan's chambers, the tension was thick enough to snap in half. The judge rubbed his temples as the assistant DA, Maria Torres, paced across the carpet. "We can't let this fester," she said. "You know what happens when someone like Dr. Hughes gets disrespected like that, especially in front of an audience." Macmillan leaned back in his chair. "I agree. But the optics, Maria. If we reprimand Crow publicly, it becomes political. If we stay quiet, we risk a civil firestorm." Torres stopped pacing. "She didn't even raise her voice, Judge. She didn't need to. He yelled at her in a courtroom, on a recorded day, in front of witnesses. This won't stay internal." He sighed. "I know. That's why I requested a transcript review." She arched an eyebrow. "You're not thinking of burying this?" "No," Macmillan said. "I'm thinking of managing it before it erupts." She folded her arms. "It's already erupting. You just don't hear it yet." Outside in the lobby, two junior clerks sat side by side on a marble bench, staring at their phones. "Yo, is this real?" one whispered, tilting his screen toward his colleague. On it was a tweet, already viral. "Courtroom cop berates black woman in front row. Turns out she wrote half the ethics code he swore to uphold." Dr. Hughes, underneath, a blurry but undeniable image. Officer Crow towering over Dr. Hughes, her expression calm, his furious, over 8,000 shares in an hour. "Dude," the other clerk muttered. "He just made her a legend." Crow sat, alone, in the break room. The coffee in his styrofoam cup had long gone cold. His hands rested on his knees, back straight, like he was still on patrol. But there was no ground to stand on now. His phone buzzed again. Another text from his precinct supervisor. "We're getting calls. News is sniffing around. Keep quiet. Do not engage online." He glanced at the television in the corner. It was muted, but the headline scrolling across the bottom was clear. "Respected civil rights advocate confronted in courtroom." There was no mention of his name. Not yet. But he knew what came next. These things always started slow. Then someone leaked the full clip, then the think pieces, then the internal reviews, then the statement from the mayor's office. He was already drowning. He pulled out his phone and Googled Dr. Loretta Hughes. The results were staggering. Dozens of books, hundreds of articles, awards, lectures, court advisory roles, civil rights case reviews, keynote speeches in countries he couldn't pronounce, and then the videos. He clicked one at random. A lecture. Harvard. Law. If a badge makes you arrogant, it's not a badge, it's a costume. Crow shut it off. Her voice in that video, it was the same one she'd used in the courtroom, soft, controlled, lethal. He rubbed his temples, then looked at his reflection in the vending machine glass. For a second, he didn't recognize the man staring back. Meanwhile, Dr. Hughes sat in the back seat of a Blacktown car, quietly reading the note she'd been given. It was from the State Ethics Commissioner. "We appreciate your discretion. Your assessment is invaluable. I'll await your recommendation in the formal report." She folded it carefully and tucked it into her leather-bound notebook. Her fingers brushed the edges of a small, worn photograph. Tucked inside the back cover, her father in a courtroom in 1965, shackled, smiling through the chains. She never forgot where she came from or why she did this. Her phone buzzed, a text from her goddaughter Layla. "You didn't tell me you were going to court today. That video is everywhere. They're calling you the silent judge. You're trending, Auntie." Dr. Hughes smiled faintly, then responded, "Some things don't need a voice. They need a mirror." At the local news station, a young producer was pitching the story. "I'm telling you, this has legs," she insisted. "It's not just another cop yells moment. This woman has influence. She's a silent force. This isn't just a clip. It's a collapse." The editor raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Collapse of what?" she grinned. "The old way." Back at the courthouse, Officer Crow was called into a meeting. He entered the conference room, where Judge Macmillan, Maria Torres, and the court administrator were waiting. Macmillan didn't waste time. "We're conducting an internal review. You will be temporarily reassigned until further notice." Crow opened his mouth, but the judge held up a hand. "This is not punishment. Yet. But the footage has gone viral. The public is aware, and more importantly, Dr. Hughes is watching." Crow's voice cracked. "So that's it? One interaction and I'm out?" Torres stepped forward. That one interaction revealed everything. He looked between them. "What do I do now?" Macmillan's voice dropped to a low rumble. "Pray she doesn't speak." And elsewhere, in a law school classroom 3 states away, a professor paused mid-lecture to play the courtroom video. Her students watched in silence. When she tuned, the clip ended. The professor turned to the board and wrote in bold, "Dignity doesn't need volume." The next morning, Officer Crow walked into the precinct, and the silence was different. It wasn't the usual Monday morning grogginess. It wasn't even the kind of silence that came after a long night on shift. It was sharper, tighter, like a held breath stretched across the bullpen. Conversation stopped when he entered. Eyes dipped away, the buzz of printers, the beep of entry scanners. That was all that dared make noise. He made his way to his desk, ignoring the way Officer Lenny didn't greet him like usual, or how Sergeant Mendoza didn't bother with the morning brief. The room had changed, or maybe he had. He sat, unlocked. His computer, and the first email he saw was from Internal Affairs. Subject, Notice of Preliminary Inquiry. Officer Daniel Crow. It wasn't unexpected, but it still made his fingers tremble. He clicked the second email. This one was worse. Subject, Temporary removal from courtroom assignments. Pending review. It was real now. The badge on his chest wasn't just heavy, it was radioactive. Across the room, Detective Parker muttered to someone under his breath. Crow couldn't catch the words, but he saw the smirk that followed. He was becoming the story. Meanwhile, miles across the city, Dr. Loretta Hughes sat by her sunlit kitchen window, slowly stirring a cup of tea. The window overlooked her small backyard, barren now, winter settling in, but she stared at it like it held secrets no one else could see. She'd been up since 5 a.m. Her inbox was a battlefield. Reporters requesting statements, podcasts wanting interviews, civil rights organizations offering praise, invitations to speak at events, and, of course, death threats, all for saying one sentence in a courtroom. She didn't reply to any of them. Not yet. She reached for a folder on her kitchen table, the one she always kept close. Inside, a growing list of names, departments, dates, and incidents. Not all were public. Some weren't even reported yet. But they were real. She'd spent years compiling them, and now one more name was going to be added. She opened to a fresh page. Crow Daniel, officer, 14th District Courthouse. She paused, pen hovering. Then slowly she wrote, public verbal targeting, derogatory racial address, conducted in open court, no provocation, immediate reassignment, viral recording present, authority imbalance. She paused again, then underlined 2 words, power misused. Back at the courthouse, Judge Macmillan sat. At his desk, staring at his laptop screen, the video paused mid-frame. Crow's face was frozen in mid-gesture, angry, red, looming. He exhaled deeply and closed the laptop. This wasn't supposed to happen in his courtroom. His courtroom was orderly, controlled. But now, something bigger than policy had entered the building. Reputation, race, public accountability. None of those things sat quietly anymore. A knock at his door. It was Torres again, folder in hand. The transcript's done. He took it, flipped through the pages. Torres leaned on the doorway. You know what I find funny? What's that? She didn't even raise her voice, but that courtroom hasn't sounded the same since. Macmillan nodded. Now the silence has teeth. Crow stepped outside the precinct just after noon, needing air that didn't taste like shame. As he walked past the coffee shop across the street, a woman inside spotted him through the window. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just stared, long enough for him to feel it, to know she'd seen the video. At the street corner, a teenage boy on a scooter passed by and muttered, "Yo, that's the dude from the clip." Laughter. Abe followed. It cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He quickened his pace. At a private university uptown, Dr. Hughes guest lectured in a seminar class. Not on law, not on justice, on power. The courtroom, she said to her students, isn't where power starts. It's where power reveals itself. One student raised his hand. So what do we do when that power goes unchecked? She answered without hesitation. You make it visible, shame it, if necessary. But most importantly, you let the silence stretch. Because real accountability doesn't come from outrage. It comes from reflection. That night, Officer Crow scrolled through Twitter on mute. His name hadn't trended yet, but her name had. Dr. Loretta Hughes, the woman who didn't flinch one. Tweet read, she didn't need to fight back. The world fought for her. Another, he barked at her like she was beneath him. Turns out she was miles above. Crow clicked one last tweet before tossing his phone across the room. It was a quote graphic with her photo. When you confuse silence for weakness, you end up shouting at a queen. Elsewhere, in a modest church office, Reverend Paul Jameson met with 2 young organizers from a local justice initiative. She doesn't want the spotlight, one of them said, but we think now's the time. Jameson nodded. She's waited her whole life for others to step forward. But now the world's looking directly at her. He looked up at the faded photo of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the wall. Some people march with their feet, others with their silence. Back in her home, Dr. Hughes sat at her desk writing, not tweets, not responses, a formal statement, not for the public, for the system. She titled it, When the Courtroom Fails Its Own Justice. On the third day after the incident, the courthouse hallways began echoing with a different kind of silence. The kind where people knew something serious had happened, but no one wanted to be the first to say it. Crow felt it with every step. People no longer nodded when he passed. They glanced sideways, whispered after he turned, pretended to check their phones when they crossed paths with him. The ones who had laughed loudest at his jokes now barely made eye contact. Even the new recruits, rookies in gray suits, still learning their way through courthouse security, looked at him like he was a cautionary tale. Crow tried to act normal. He clocked in, walked his rounds, stood in the back of courtroom 3 like he always did, but his position didn't carry weight anymore. It carried memory, the memory of him yelling at the wrong woman, and the weight of what that silence had cost him. Dr. Loretta Hughes wasn't at the courthouse that day. She was at her modest townhouse on the south side of the city, where framed newspaper clippings from the 70s lined the hallway walls, and a soft piano melody played in the background like it had lived there forever. She wore a charcoal sweater and loose linen pants, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. She was editing a legal brief when the knock came. A pause, then 2 more knocks. She already knew who it was. "Come in," she called out. The door creaked open, revealing a familiar face. Young, sharp-eyed, holding a press badge. Nia Baldwin, 28, investigative reporter, and one of Dr. Hughes' brightest former students. She hadn't called ahead, and yet Dr. Hughes already had a second teacup set beside hers. "Still punctual," Dr. Hughes said, with a warm but measured smile. "You're trending globally and sipping tea like it's Sunday," Nia said, shaking her head. "I had to come see you myself," Dr. Hughes gestured for her to sit. "The truth doesn't need a trumpet, it just needs ears." Nia laughed. "That sounds like something from your lectures." "It was," Hughes said. "You never quoted me then." "I didn't understand it then." Dr. Hughes leaned forward. "Do you now?" Nia nodded slowly. "You said silence, when rooted in truth, isn't empty. It's loaded, and in the courtroom, it detonated." Back at the courthouse, Crow was called into a supervisor's office. The door clicked shut behind him with the finality of a vault. Captain Rosenthal sat behind the desk. No smile, no welcome. "Crow, we received the formal complaint this morning," he said, sliding a document across the table. "Not from Dr. Hughes, from the ethics board." Crow's stomach dropped. "She hasn't even spoken yet." "Exactly," the captain replied. "And that silence is making more noise than anything you could ever say." Crow didn't respond. Rosenthal continued, "There are 2 kinds of exposure in this world, Crow. The kind you choose, and the kind that chooses you." Nisha sipped her tea, then leaned in. "Why that courtroom? Why that case? You could have sat in on 100 others." Dr. Hughes gazed out the window. The light filtering through the curtain made her eyes glow. "Gold. That courtroom," she said slowly, "was the first one I was ever denied entry into." Nia blinked. "I was 22. Hughes continued. "Fresh out of undergrad, I wore my best skirt, held my resume in a leather folder. I had an interview for an administrative clerk position. A white bailiff told me, 'You people don't even understand the law, let alone work in it.' He never let me through the door." She paused, the memory alive and still sharp. "I didn't go back for 12 years. Not until I was an attorney arguing civil litigation." Nia sat silently, humbled. Dr. Hughes smiled faintly. "Some places aren't haunted by ghosts, they're haunted by arrogance." "And now?" Nia asked. "Why show up now?" Dr. Hughes leaned back. "Because I needed to see if the ghosts had learned to listen." That afternoon in the break room, Crow overheard 2 junior officers talking. They didn't know he was in the corner. She didn't even raise her voice. "Man, if someone spoke to my mother like that—" "You!" Saw how calm she stayed? That shook me more than if she'd gone off. Crow left without finishing his coffee. By evening, the headlines shifted. "The woman who didn't yell and still won." Dr. Hughes reminds. "America, silence can indict too. Courtroom power." Shift a reckoning in real time. Blogs, podcasts, even morning shows were picking it up. One podcast host summarized it best. We're so used to viral moments being about shouting, screaming, protesting. But this one was about presence. A black woman walked into a courtroom, got yelled at, and let the world do the shouting for her. At her desk, Dr. Hughes wrote in her journal something she hadn't done in years. When power trembles, it doesn't always fall with a bang. Sometimes it rusts quietly, until one day it crumbles under the weight of its own myth. She closed the book, took off her glasses, and looked at the photo of her father again. "Still marching, Daddy," she whispered. That night, as Crow walked through the parking garage, he passed a janitor he'd never paid attention to before. An older black man, thin frame, salt and pepper beard. As Crow walked by, the janitor paused. "You know," he said without turning, "I saw the clip." Crow stopped. The man didn't face him, and I saw the look in your eyes when she didn't. Lynch, that look, that's fear. Not of her skin, not of her age, but of the fact that she didn't even need to speak to beat you. The janitor turned, stared Crow in the face. "Now you know what power really looks like." Crow didn't reply. He just walked into the dark. For the first time in years, Dr. Loretta Hughes let her phone ring without answering. The mayor's office, civil rights leaders, national journalists, even her former students, now prominent voices, in their own right, all calling, all wanting a quote, a soundbite, a direction, but she gave none. And that decision, her refusal to speak, hit harder than any headline. She had become the epicenter of a cultural earthquake, and she hadn't moved an inch since. In a downtown boardroom tucked behind City Hall, 3 men and 2 women sat across from Officer Crow. A panel, suits, not uniforms, no badges. They weren't here to investigate, they were here to evaluate. Crow sat rigid, palms on the table. His voice was even, memorized. I reacted to what I believed was an unauthorized presence in a reserved area of the courtroom. My intention was to maintain order and uphold procedure. The woman at the center of the panel, stern-faced and quiet until now, leaned forward. "Officer Crow, are you aware of who Dr. Hughes is?" He hesitated. "I am now. And if you had known that then," he paused again, "would you have acted differently?" The silence following that question was surgical. Finally, he muttered, "Probably." One of the other board members scribbled something in his notepad. The woman nodded slightly. "So it wasn't about procedure, it was about perception." Crow stiffened. "That's not fair." "No," she said, her voice like cold steel. "What happened in that courtroom wasn't fair." Crow's eyes dropped. Meanwhile, inside, a quiet university library, Nia Baldwin sat across from a circle of graduate students. She played the now viral clip of Crow yelling, then paused it just as Dr. Hughes lifted her hand. "What do you see?" she asked them. One student said, "Power without shouting." Another, "The beginning of a reckoning." But the last one said it best. She made the system look at itself. Crow left the boardroom feeling like gravity had changed. He stepped outside into the windless, overcast afternoon, where the air smelled like cold steel and regret. He didn't know where to go. He had hours left in his shift, but nowhere left to stand. So he walked past the courthouse, past the park bench where a homeless veteran usually waved at him, but now didn't even lift his eyes, past the bagel shop, where the barista who always joked with him stayed silent. His badge was still on his chest, but it didn't open doors anymore. Back at home, Dr. Hughes stood in her backyard with a rake in her hand, gently clearing fallen leaves. The motions were slow, meditative, not rushed. Inside the house, the television played a muted segment. Will Dr. Hughes break her silence? The image of her face hovered in the corner of the screen, dignified and quiet. She ignored it. Her neighbor, an older white woman named Elaine, approached the fence with a Tupperware container. "I saw the news," Elaine said softly. "You You handled it like a queen, Dr. Hughes offered a smile. Thank you, Elaine, but queens still bleed. Elaine hesitated. If you ever need anything. Dr. Hughes set the rake aside and walked over. What we all need, she said, is to notice what we ignored for too long. Elaine nodded. Then she said something unexpected. My grandson, she whispered, just applied for the police academy. I told him to read everything you've ever written. Later that night, Officer Crow sat on his worn couch, uniform still. On watching one of Dr. Hughes's archived lectures on YouTube, her voice filled the room. Dignity is not the absence of pain. It is the refusal to let that pain be used against you. He stared at the screen, her words cutting deeper than any reprimand. He paused the video and rewound the last sentence. Refusal to let that pain be used against you. He repeated it out loud, almost like a confession. That same evening, Nia Baldwin sat in her small studio apartment, piecing together a new article. Title, When Silence Becomes a Verdict. She stared at the screen, fingers hovering above the keys. Then she typed, Dr. Loretta Hughes did not raise her voice. She did not press charges. She did not post a thread, host a press conference, or demand a resignation. She simply stood, unflinching, and let the world decide if it was comfortable watching itself in her reflection. She hit save draft, leaned back and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Elsewhere in the city, Reverend Paul Jameson addressed a town hall. We keep asking why she didn't shout back, he said to the crowd. But the real question is, why did her silence hurt so many people in power? Murmurs rippled. He raised a hand. She didn't break anything. She revealed what was already broken. The room fell quiet. Then someone in the back stood and clapped. Others followed. At sunrise the next morning, Dr. Hughes received an envelope. In the mail, no return address, just her name in elegant script, inside a folded card. No message, just a badge, Officer Crow's, with a note clipped to it. I've learned more in your silence than I ever did in training. I'm not proud of who I've been, but I want to change who I become, Daniel Crow. She read it once, then again. Then, without a word, she placed the badge inside the folder where all the other names were listed. But this one she did not underline. The world loved how calm she was. Every talk show, every column, every think piece, everyone praised her for grace under fire, for the quiet storm, for her dignified stillness. But no one knew what it cost to stay calm. Not really. Not like she did. Dr. Loretta Hughes sat alone at her kitchen table, flipping through a worn leather journal. The pages had thinned over time, the ink faded in places, but the entries still burned with clarity. May 17th, 1967. Daddy came home bruised again. Said the cops mistook him for someone else. Mama didn't believe it, neither did I. I was only 5, but I saw how his eyes never looked the same again. August 2nd, 1972. They called me Monkey Girl in school today. I told the teacher. She said, "Don't make trouble." So I sat still. But it still hurt. April 14th, 1980. Denied entry to courtroom internship. No reason, just a look. Just a smile from the man at the gate. That kind of smile that says, "Try again, little girl." I didn't cry, not once. I just wrote this down. Calm, always calm. Each line was a scar written in ink. Each entry a memory that could have broken her, but didn't, because she learned early. Anger got dismissed. But silence. Silence made people lean in. Meanwhile, in a small cafe not far from the city's law school, Officer Crow sat across from a woman who had once looked up to him. Detective René Martin. Black. Bold. Brilliant. She had trained under him during her rookie year, back when he still believed he was a good man. Now she was staring at him like a stranger. "Why are you here, Dan?" she asked, no warmth in her voice. "I need to understand something," he said. "Too late for that." "Maybe," he said, "but I need to try." She didn't speak, just sipped her coffee. "I yelled at a woman," Crow said finally. "I didn't know who she was, but even if I had, you still would have done it," she finished. "Because you didn't see a who, you saw a what." Crow looked down. "That's the problem," Renee continued. "And it's not just you, it's the whole damn structure we're taught to protect. You yell at her like she's furniture. She sits still, and suddenly everyone's uncomfortable." He clenched his fists. Renee leaned in. "She didn't destroy you. She exposed you. That hit harder than he expected. She trained me," Renee added. "Taught me how to sit through meetings where men talked over me. Taught me how to document everything without losing my mind. Taught me that silence is strategy." Crow nodded slowly. "That badge I gave her, she doesn't need it." Renee cut in. "You needed to give it." And just like that, he understood. That night, Dr. Hughes attended a private gathering at the local Black Cultural Center. No cameras, no press. Just a room full of elders, advocates, teachers, and a few students standing quietly at the back, hoping to catch wisdom like rain. She didn't speak for the first 30 minutes. Just listened. Then someone asked, "How do you stay so composed?" She looked around the room before answering. "I don't." The crowd stilled. "I carry my rage in my ribs," she continued. "I bury it under law books and quiet stares. I burn in every meeting where someone calls me articulate, like it's a compliment. I scream into pillows. I pray in bathrooms. But when I enter the room, especially their rooms, I carry peace like a weapon. No applause, just reverence." Across town, Crow sat in his apartment surrounded by old notebooks from training. He flipped to one page where his instructor had once written, "Never let your badge become a mask." He hadn't understood it then. Now he did. He closed the notebook, then opened his laptop and drafted a message. Not to Dr. Hughes, but to his department. "I request to begin a 6-month leave for self-education, counseling, and restorative service. I would like to work under programs that rebuild trust with communities of color, without a badge, without a uniform, just as a man learning to listen." He didn't send it yet, but he would. Later that week, Dr. Hughes walked through the old courthouse archives where her father's original trial records had been stored. She pulled one. Hughes, LSR. Arrest. Record 1965, disturbance during peace, rally charge, disorderly conduct. Result, dismissed. She stared at the file. Not because of the charge, because of the silence in the file. No apology, no context, no acknowledgement of who he really was. A peaceful teacher, not a threat. The same silence they gave her now. But this time, silence didn't mean surrender. It meant legacy. On her walk home, a young girl no older than 12 crossed her path. She stopped, eyes wide. "Are you that lady from the video?" Dr. Hughes smiled gently. "Depends on what the video showed." The girl grinned. "You didn't yell back. My mom said that was real power." Dr. Hughes bent down slightly. "What do you think power is?" The girl thought, then whispered, "It's when they expect you to break, but you don't." "Smart girl," Dr. Hughes said. "Never forget that." That evening, in the center of the city, a mural appeared overnight. Spray paint. Shadows. Bold colors. Dr. Hughes, seated calmly, eyes forward, hands folded in her lap, and across the wall in clean, white strokes. She spoke without a sound, and the system shook. The walls of Courtroom 3 had seen countless outbursts, shouts, protests, slammed gavels, emotional testimony, tears. But the only moment etched into everyone's memory was the silence. The moment Dr. Loretta Hughes lifted her hand, didn't yell, didn't argue, just stopped him. And somehow that single moment had bent the trajectory of a courthouse built to ignore people like her. In the early morning hours, long before court opened, a maintenance worker found something tucked behind the judge's bench. A small card. On it, typed in bold, "We do not shout to be heard. We Exist. That should be enough. There was no signature, but everyone knew who it belonged to. Across the city, in a windowless boardroom filled with dusty law books and cold coffee, a closed-door meeting was underway. 5 high-level judicial administrators sat around a table. Behind them, a projection screen showed an image from the courtroom video, the moment Dr. Hughes locked eyes with Officer Crow. "I'm telling you," one man said, "this isn't about the cop anymore. This is about optics." A woman in a burgundy blazer leaned forward. "No, this is about credibility. We've written handbooks on ethics, on equity, and now we have footage proving we ignored the very culture we claimed to fix." Another added, "The training manuals are outdated. The oversight committees are performative." She didn't say a word, and we all felt the indictment. The room went quiet until the oldest member, a retired judge turned advisor, spoke. "I sat on that bench for 42 years, he said, his voice slow. "I've seen every form of defiance, but I've never seen a silence that scared the system like hers did." A decision was made in that room, mandatory reform, and this time not just in writing. Meanwhile, at a quiet university amphitheater, Dr. Hughes stood behind the curtain, watching the audience fill the seats for an unscheduled event. There were no posters, no flyers, only a simple email sent by a former student. Dr. Hughes taught us how to stand. Even when seated, the room overflowed. Professors, students, journalists, activists, even courtroom staff who had once only known her as that quiet lady in the front row. Nia Baldwin stood at the podium first. No introduction needed. She said no ceremony, just presence. Then, without another word, the audience rose and stayed standing, silent, no claps, no chants, just human acknowledgement. Dr. Hughes stepped out, eyes glistening. She didn't speak. She bowed once, and the entire room bowed their heads back. Across town, Officer Crow had begun his leave. Day 1. No badge, no weapon, no uniform, just a notebook, and a volunteer ID badge for the city's Community Reconciliation Office. He was assigned to a mentorship circle, a group of at-risk teens who met weekly to talk about justice, fear, and trust. He didn't talk for the first 3 sessions. He just listened. It wasn't easy. Some of them knew who he was. One even asked, "You that guy who tried to bark at the Queen?" He didn't deny it, didn't deflect. He just nodded and said, "Yeah, that was me." The teen shook his head. "Man, you got cooked without her even saying a word." Crow smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said, "I needed that." At a news studio uptown, a popular anchor rehearsed the segment she knew would get her fired. She looked into the mirror backstage, then down at her script. "We scream into microphones." She spoke with her posture. "We riot with hashtags." She made silence louder than sirens. She didn't ask for change. She forced it to arrive. Later that week, a statue was commissioned, privately funded, no government ties. It was small, bronze, no pedestal, just a woman seated calmly, back straight, hands folded, eyes steady, and below it, a plaque that read, "She never raised her voice, but the walls remembered." Meanwhile, in her study, Dr. Hughes received a thick envelope. Inside, the formal report from the Ethics Board. It listed 47 changes to policy. In the cover letter, one line stood out. This was not a reaction to public pressure. This was a response to your silence. She folded the letter, placed it beside her father's trial transcript, then picked up her pen. She began writing again, not in her journal, but a new book. Working title, When Silence Becomes Law. That evening, she took a walk through her old neighborhood. The kids playing jump rope didn't know who she was. That was fine. An old man sitting outside a barbershop did. He tipped his hat. "I see you," he said. "And I see you," she replied. No photos, no noise, just shared recognition. At a local high school, a teacher asked her class to define courage. Most said things like standing up, fighting back, or speaking out. But one girl raised her hand and said, "Courage is sitting down when they want you to run. Courage is being quiet when the world is loud. Courage is when a courtroom full of power freezes because a black woman didn't flinch." The teacher wrote that on the board, and no one erased it. At midnight, Officer Crow sat on a rooftop, watching the city lights flicker. He opened his notebook and wrote, "I spent years thinking my voice mattered most. But maybe the best thing I can do now is shut up and make space." He closed the book and whispered into the night, "Thank you, Dr. Hughes. Not for forgiving him, not for fixing him, but for showing him who he really was and what he still could be." It had been 27 days since Dr. Hughes sat in Courtroom 3 and changed the country without raising her voice. Now she returned. Same coat, same shoes, same quiet presence, but everything else had changed. The moment she entered the building, people stood a little straighter. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Officers adjusted their badges. Secretaries softened their tone. She didn't. Command the air. The air had simply learned to respect her. The hearing today wasn't about her, at least not directly. It was the final review of the proposed judiciary reforms, courtroom behavior protocols, racial de-escalation training, community-led oversight on police presence inside legal spaces. The public wasn't allowed to speak during this session, but they were watching, every seat filled, every wall lined with silent observers, news crews outside, hashtags trending. Inside, the room was nearly silent, but it wasn't fear, it was attention, the kind of silence given to someone who's earned it. Dr. Hughes sat in her same seat, front row, center, the same seat Officer Crow had once told her she didn't belong in. Now it was unofficially known as the Hughes seat. Judge Macmillan sat at the bench, no longer simply a legal figure, but now a man permanently linked to an awakening. He cleared his throat. "The Committee on Courtroom Conduct and Equity has reviewed all proposed revisions. These measures are not just corrective. They are overdue, and in some ways they're ceremonial, because the truth is, change already started the moment it was demanded without being spoken." He paused, eyes flicking to the front row. Dr. Hughes didn't blink. Macmillan continued, "And so today we adopt every item unanimously, effective immediately." There was no applause, just breath held and then exhaled, like a courtroom finally allowed to feel again. Outside, Officer Crow stood across the street. He wasn't in uniform. He hadn't worn it since the day he placed his badge in that envelope. But he was present, not to be seen, but to see. He watched Dr. Hughes exit the courthouse as calmly as she'd entered. She didn't smile, she didn't wave, she didn't acknowledge the cameras, but she didn't need to. The world was already listening. Later that afternoon, Crow met with his reconciliation group. The room was filled with tough kids who didn't trust anyone, much less a cop, even one on leave. Today's theme was redemption. One boy, maybe 16, asked, "What does making it right actually look like?" Crow didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "It's not about fixing what you broke. It's about staying in the room after it shatters and listening to the people sweeping up the glass." The boy stared at him for a while, then nodded once. Dr. Hughes received an envelope that evening. No address, no name. Inside was a single photograph. It was old, black and white, faded. Her father, standing beside the same courthouse, in handcuffs. Head high, on the back, in smudged ink. "They silenced me once. You made the silence matter." She didn't cry. She simply placed it beside his file, now framed and hanging near her study window. Nia Baldwin's article finally went live that night. The title, "The Day the Courtroom Held Its Breath." Within hours, it was shared by senators, activists, educators, and celebrities. One quote stood out, "We spend lifetimes asking to be heard. But sometimes history changes the moment someone refuses to raise their voice, because they already know the world will echo their silence. The next morning, Crow received a call, unknown number. He hesitated, then answered, a soft, familiar voice on the line. "Mr. Crow," Dr. Hughes said, "not as an enemy, not as a savior, just a woman who had already won." He nearly stopped breathing. "Yes. Ma'am," he said, "I received your badge and your note. Thank you for reading it." A pause. "You asked what you should become," she said. "I don't have that answer, but I do know this. Apology without action is performance. And silence, when rooted in reflection, is sometimes the most honest sound a man can make." "Yes, ma'am." Another pause. "You're still learning," she said. "That's good. The world needs more students." The line went dead, but it echoed for hours. That weekend, a small community library hosted a panel. Power in the Quiet. Dr. Hughes didn't attend, but a dozen of her former students did. One of them stood and read a poem. They asked her why she didn't scream. She said, "Because my breath wasn't theirs to steal." They asked her why she didn't stand. She said, "Because I already filled the space." The audience was silent. Then they rose, not to clap, but to honor the silence. Again. And back in Courtroom 3, the chair in the front row remained empty for weeks. No one dared sit there. Until one morning, a young black girl, maybe 12, entered the room with her school's debate club. She saw the seat, asked no one for permission, and sat, back straight, hands folded, eyes forward, and for the first time since Dr. Hughes had left that courtroom. The walls remembered again. The courthouse buzzed with an energy it hadn't felt in decades. Not frenzy, not chaos, but awareness. There was something sacred about today's air, like every breath carried memory. The case was procedural, on paper. Just another civil suit. A black teacher falsely accused and wrongfully detained by a rookie cop at a shopping center. But the energy in the room said otherwise. This wasn't just a trial. This was a mirror. Dr. Hughes hadn't said she would come. She never announced her presence. She didn't RSVP, but the courtroom left the front row open anyway, and 20 minutes before the trial began, she arrived. Same pace, same coat, same expression. No camera flashes, no red carpet, but the room shifted the second she walked in. Even the gavel on Judge Macmillan's bench lay untouched, like it too was waiting for her to settle. She took her usual seat, folded her hands, and once again didn't speak. In the back row, Officer Crow sat in plain clothes. He'd received a discreet invite from the community board. "We believe you're still learning. Watch this one." He did. He watched everything. The defendant, a black middle school teacher named Mr. Reuben Tolles, sat flanked by lawyers who looked more nervous than he did. His chin was high, his eyes calm. He reminded Crow of someone, not because of what he said, but because of how still he sat. Across from him, the officer who detained him looked barely old enough to shave, sweating, fidgeting, clearly coached, but visibly shaken. The irony wasn't lost on Crow, a younger version of himself, now being examined under a microscope that didn't flinch. Judge Macmillan entered and called the room to order. But before he could strike the gavel, his eyes met hers. She nodded once. He hesitated, then lowered the gavel. He didn't strike it. He just began. Like noise was no longer necessary. The trial proceeded like most. Witness testimonies, security footage, a grainy video from a bystander. But the tension wasn't in the evidence. It was in the audience. Every time Dr. Hughes shifted in her seat, pens stopped moving. Every time she blinked, lawyers paused mid-sentence. Her silence had weight. And now, it was law. The most powerful moment came when the young officer was asked, "Why did you suspect Mr. Tolles was committing a crime?" He paused, swallowed, then said, "I just had a feeling." Based on what? The courtroom froze. Even Crow knew the answer. The young officer didn't speak, just looked at Mr. Tolles, then at Dr. Hughes, then at the floor. It was the first honest moment in the entire trial, and it landed louder than any testimony. That night, the courtroom transcript made its way onto law school message boards, not for the legal points, but for the moment when Dr. Hughes didn't stand, didn't object, and still managed to make the room confront itself. Someone titled the post, "The Day Even the Gavel Paused." Crow exited the courtroom in silence. He didn't look for her, didn't expect acknowledgement. But as he passed by a bench near the exit, he saw a notebook resting alone, his name written on the front. He opened it. Inside, a single line: "Justice doesn't need your voice. It needs your change." No signature, but he knew who wrote it. That evening, Dr. Hughes lit a candle in her study. She didn't do it often. Only when someone else had carried the weight for a day. She opened her journal and wrote. He sat still. He looked afraid. But he stayed. That matters. Then she closed the journal and let the silence return, not as an absence, but as a presence. Outside the courthouse, a mural artist returned to the bronze statue of Dr. Hughes. He added a single painted line beneath the original. Quote, "Even the gavel paused." People gathered. They took photos, but no one spoke, because they didn't need to. Back in his small apartment, Crow placed the notebook on his kitchen table, then pulled out his own and wrote for the first time in days. "Today I saw what it means. To be still and powerful. I used to think law was about who spoke loudest. Now I understand it's about who speaks last, even if it's in silence." At a community town hall 2 nights later, Reverend Jameson quoted her without naming her. "There are people in this world who carry the weight of generations without letting it crush them, not because they're invincible, but because they know when to let silence speak louder than rage." The room stood, not in protest, in honor. In her kitchen the next morning, Dr. Hughes brewed tea. The radio buzzed in the background. News of another trial, another policy, another incident. But this time, she didn't feel exhausted. She felt witnessed. Her silence had echoed across walls she wasn't even present in, and it was still echoing. She stepped onto her porch, sipping quietly, when a young officer across the street knew. Recruit nervous energy, glanced her way. He nodded unsure. She nodded back, and in that one moment nothing was said. But everything changed. Rain fell softly on the city like a benediction, not the stormy kind, but the kind that makes windows glow. Warmer, makes streets look reflective, like the entire world paused to look at itself. It was the morning of the new judiciary oath ceremony. And for the first time in state history, the event would include a preamble written by a civilian, Dr. Loretta Hughes. She didn't attend the ceremony. She was invited, begged even, but she declined. She said she had other plans that day. When asked what was more important than witnessing the moment her words became law, she answered simply, "I already witnessed the world change once. I don't need to see it again. I just need to believe it won't change back." Instead, she spent the morning sitting on a wooden bench at Lincoln Park, the same park where her father once gave community speeches under threat of police batons. The city had changed, the faces had changed, but the roots of silence, pain, and resilience still ran through the ground beneath her feet. She brought no book, no phone, just presence. A young boy on a bicycle rode past and circled back. "Are you the quiet lady from the video?" She smiled. "Maybe. My mum says, your silence saved a lot of people." She thought for a second, then said, "No, my silence reminded them they were worth saving." He didn't understand, but one day he would. Across town, Officer Crow stood behind a microphone for the first time in his life without a badge on his chest. The community board had asked him to speak at a justice forum, not as a cop, as a man. Who'd been wrong. The crowd was skeptical. Rightfully so. He stood tall, but not proud, just accountable. "My name is Daniel Crow," he began. "And I was the man who yelled, the man who profiled, the man who thought silence was weakness. No applause, only attention. I won't tell you I've changed completely, because unlearning years of superiority doesn't happen in a month. But I will tell you that silence changed me. Her silence." He paused, looked at the crowd. She didn't call for my job. She didn't press charges. She didn't drag my name. She just let me hear myself. And that was worse than anything the law could have done. Someone in the back wiped a tear. Crow continued. "So if you're here today wondering what justice looks like, it's this. Not a courtroom win, not a viral video, but a man standing here unarmed by ego, finally listening." A long pause, then a single clap, then two, then silence again, but this time it was earned. At the university, a lecture room was renamed, the Loretta Hughes School of Quiet Power. No press release. No ribbon cutting, just a new sign. And a quote etched above the door. "You don't need to raise your voice when your presence speaks truth." In elementary schools, a new curriculum began under the title Courage in Stillness, Stories of Nonviolent Power. Lesson 1, Her Story. In police academies, recruits now watched the courtroom clip during their first week. Not to mock, but to learn. The section was called When Authority Meets Accountability, and after every screening, instructors asked the same question: "What would you have done differently?" Silence followed. And for the first time in those halls, silence was respected. Back at the park, Dr. Hughes ran her fingers across the memorial plaque that had recently been installed under the old oak tree. It read, "In memory of L. Hughes Sr., teacher, speaker, dreamer. He stood for peace. His daughter sat for justice." She sat beside it quietly, her eyes soft. A woman with a stroller passed by and whispered, "Thank you." Dr. Hughes didn't reply. She didn't need to. In the state capitol, the governor signed a declaration naming October 5th, Day of Still Justice. The bill passed with bipartisan support and a silent vote of 99-0 because no one dared oppose. What they could no longer deny, Nia Baldwin released a follow-up documentary titled She Didn't Say a Word. In it, she asked no questions, just played footage, memories, testimony. At the end, Nia's narration said, "History remembers speeches, but sometimes it's the unsaid that rewrites the world." Officer Crow now worked full-time at a reconciliation center. He answered phones, he cleaned floors, he sat in back rows of forums and never once asked to speak again. He learned how to stay invisible until trust invited him forward. And one day, it did. A teenage girl handed him a folded paper and said, "We believe you now." Dr. Hughes received a package at her door. No name. Inside, a single painting. It showed a courtroom scene. She sat in the front row, hands folded. Behind her, the entire audience stood, but their mouths were covered, honoring her. At the bottom, the painter had written, "When she sat down, the nation stood." She placed it by her fireplace, didn't say a word, just closed her eyes and let the silence speak.